Hello, everybody. Hi. Thank you for your patience. We are trying something new for the first time at Courageous Community, and so we really appreciate your grace as we figure out how to run through this experiment smoothly. I'm Jessica Green, and together with Reverend Dr. Zena Jacques and Claire Nelson, we welcome you to Courageous Conversations, presented by Urban Consulate with Barrington's White House, where we have been gathering for 3 years to explore how to foster greater inclusion and belonging in our communities. Are we okay on sound, guys? Yeah? Okay. Tonight, we're also joined by our friends from Telos. Hi, Telos. Telos works to form communities of American peacemakers across lines of difference. Telos offers an immersive learning journey through the American South, including many sites featured in the book we are discussing tonight. And we're excited to welcome Urban Consulate friends virtually from across the country. Welcome, 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 everyone. So, since this is a little bit of a different modality for us tonight, I just want to situate ourselves for the viewers and for all of us in the room. I'm sitting here, well, I'm standing right now, at Barrington's White House in the Chicagoland area with our Courageous Community Builders. I just want a round of applause for you guys. Thank you for being here in person. We gather monthly on second Wednesdays, and so I'm just thrilled to have you here tonight. Thank you for coming. Zena and Clint are sitting in the Washington, D.C. area, where Zena and Clint both live and work. They are joining us tonight from Alfred Street Baptist Church, where Zena leads the small group ministry. And I know for the Christian community, it is a very busy week, being Holy Week, so Zena, we really appreciate you taking the time out to be with us. Then we have friends virtually from across the U.S., from Detroit to Cincinnati to Portland to Hawaii. I had to ask Claire, who's calling in from Hawaii? It's not me. I wouldn't mind being there, though. Anyways, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are both recording and live streaming tonight, and we ask, like I said before, for your grace. We've never tried a hybrid cross-city dialogue exactly like this before, but a huge gratitude to our behind-the-scenes team, both in Barrington and in DC, Bobby, Yaya, JP, and Connor, for making the magic happen for us tonight. All right, so speaking of tonight, we'll start with a conversation between Zena and Clint, then open for Q&A. So please be thinking of your questions as you listen to their conversation. For friends online, please type your questions in the question box. For friends here at Barrington's White House, please be thinking of any questions as you listen, and when it's time, we'll ask you to come up to the mic and ask them yourself. As always, we're holding On Being's grounding virtues for this conversation tonight. For those who are in the room, oftentimes they're on the tables, but those include, for those who are not here, generous listening, humility, patience, and words matter. Thank you for joining us and practicing this in the Q&A especially, to be truly present and honor this time together. Now, without further ado, it is my honor to introduce our esteemed guest. Clint Smith is a staff writer at The Atlantic and author of the multi-award-winning narrative nonfiction book, How the World is Past, a reckoning with the history of slavery across America, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller and a 2021 National Book Critics Circle Award winner for nonfiction, and listed on too many best books of the year lists to name: Time, Amazon, The Economist, GQ, Smithsonian, Christian Science Monitor, and many more. I see a small smile coming from Clint's mouth there. You should be proud. Smith also authored the poetry collection Counting Descent, which won the 2017 Literary Award for Best Poetry Book from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, and was a finalist for an NAACP Image Award. He has received fellowships from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, New America, the Emerson Collective, the Art for Justice Fund, Cave Canem, and the National Science Foundation. His essays, poems, and scholarly writing have been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The New Republic, Poetry Magazine, The Paris Review, the Harvard Educational Review, and more. His 2 TED Talks, The Danger of Silence and How to Raise a Black Son in America, collectively have been viewed more than 9 million times. Previously, Clint taught high school in English in Prince George's County, Maryland, where in 2013 he was named the Christine D. Sarbanes Teacher of the Year by the Maryland Humanities Council. He currently teaches writing and literature in the DC Central Detention Facility. He is also the host of the YouTube series Crash Course Black American History. Clint received his BA in English from Davidson College and his PhD in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Orleans, he currently lives in Maryland with his wife and their 2 children. Clint, welcome.
Jessica, thank you. And to our friends in Barrington, we say good evening. It's odd to not be with you, but we are delighted, Clint, to welcome you. Jessica mentioned that TED Talk, and I have a quote from it. You end that TED Talk by saying, "I will live every day as if there is a microphone tucked under my tongue, a stage on the underside of my inhibition. Because who has to have a soapbox when all you ever needed was a voice?" We are grateful that you have a voice and that you have chosen to use it. We are grateful that you have chosen to pass on a good word in this amazing book. So all of us who are gathered tonight are grateful for the opportunity to hear your voice in this setting. Clint, when you set out to write this book, what was the word that you wanted passed?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you all so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Some of the previous interlocutors were, you mentioned, it is truly an honor to be in their company and to be in you all's company. And it means a lot to me that you all have spent time thinking about the book and are even more so that you're interested in visiting some of the places that the book is in conversation with. So I think, it might be helpful to give a sort of origin story of where the book emerged from, which was in 2017. I was watching several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And I was watching these statues come down, and I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street today, named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people. Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy. And public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that's not to say that taking down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond or in New Orleans or anywhere else is going to suddenly erase the racial wealth gap. But it does help us recognize the sort of ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that shape the landscape of American history and help us understand the way that certain communities have been disproportionately harmed throughout American history. And so I was thinking about this in the context of New Orleans, and I was looking around my city and, a place that was once the busiest slave market in the country. And I had a moment where I realized that I did not understand the history of slavery in any way that was commensurate with the impact that it had on the place that raised me, with any incommensurate with the impact that it had on this country. So I started looking around New Orleans and trying to get a sense of, well, what are the places and the people that are telling this story? What are the places that have a relationship to this history? And are they honest about it? Are they running from it? Or are they doing something in between? And that kind of served as the catalyst for me asking those conversations on a national and in some ways an international level, trying to get a sense of, well, what are the different historical sites, the monuments, museums, neighborhoods, plantations, prisons, all these different places that have a relationship to this history, and what is it, and how do they tell that story, and how do these different places across the country reflect the heterogeneity of public memory in this country, because there are hundreds of millions of us who all have very different sensibilities and understandings of what the history of this country is and was, and how that shapes the sort of landscape of American society today. And ultimately, it was a journey to try to fill in the gaps of my own education, the failures in my own education, right? I wanted to, people ask me about the audience or the intended audience of this book all the time, and what I wanted to do was, pass on the word, so to speak, as you put it, to the 16-year-old version of me. Like, I tried to write the sort of book that I would have wanted to read in my 10th or 11th grade American history class, the sort of book that would have given me the language, the toolkit, the framework, the information with which to understand why that, the reason one community in New Orleans looked one way and another community in New Orleans looked another way was not simply because of the people in those communities, but because of what has been done to those communities and taken from those communities generation after generation after generation. And so for me, that is where the sort of interest and curiosity and the sort of orienting framework around the book emerged.
Yeah. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to read a passage from the book. But if the 16-year-old Clint had read this book, what would have shifted in him?
So I grew up in New Orleans, and I grew up, I feel like, being inundated with messages, some implicit, some explicit, around all the things that were wrong with black people. And for so long, I felt like I didn't have the language, as I said, the language or the toolkit, the history, with which to push back against it. So I felt like I was being inundated with these messages about sort of the way that the public housing projects represented the sort of cultural depravity and moral degradation of the black community, how the violence and poverty that was saturated in these communities represented a sort of a different cultural disposition, and you know, and its most insidious, people talking about biological and genetic inherent differences, and sometimes it's as explicit as that, but sometimes it's more subtle. And when you're a young person growing up, hearing that so much of that information, if you're not given the tools with which to push back against it, at its worst, you begin to internalize it. And so I felt this sort of psychological and emotional and intellectual paralysis. And it wasn't until I became an adult and started spending time with these books that have been, you know, transformational for me. Books that have given me a more nuanced, complex, more honest story of the history of this country, that I gained a better sense of like who I was in relation to this country. And it was so liberating. It was so emancipatory. And I think all the time about James Baldwin's 1964 essay, A Talk to Teachers. And it's not one of his more famous, but it's one of my favorites. And it's based on a speech he gave to a group of New York City educators in 1963. And in it, he says that the role of the teacher, and here he's saying teacher directly because he's talking to a group of educators, but also kind of using it as a metonym for a larger society. And it's like the role of the teacher is to help the black child understand that even though the world tells them over and over and over again that they are criminal, their role is to tell them that it is in fact the society and the history that created these conditions in their community in the first place that is the real criminal. And for many of us, it feels intuitive, but I think we can forget how it's not intuitive for so many young people, for so many people across this country who are taught to think about the notion of what one deserves, or the notion of why, of what hard work, how hard work manifests itself, the notion of merit, and how one gets and succeeds and creates opportunities for upward mobility. It gives us a different sense of what those things are and what they mean. And for me, to read a book like this, I think it just would have been so liberating. It just would have helped me, because once you learn American history in its totality, this country can't lie to you anymore about why it looks the way that it does, and it can't blame demographics, like entire demographics of people, for the social conditions that they find themselves in. And I think all the time about, like, why did I have to go get a PhD at a fancy university to learn things that I should have learned in my 8th grade history class? That would have been so important for me at that moment in my life.
I think about the metaphor of a mirror and a window, and as I listen to you talk, the mirror to see the fuller and more complex history of America, but also, or the window to see that, and the mirror to see the beauty in who that 16-year-old is, who this man is, and what that would have meant for children to see through the lies and to see themselves fully. There's a passage. So I picked it. I don't know if it's your favorite, but it starts on that.
Okay.
In case those of you who may not have had the privilege of reading the book, and may I encourage you to do it through Audible, because the author reads it. And to hear you read the book to me gave me a sense of some nuances that seemed important to you. So I own the book, but I also had you read it to me, and it was blessing.
Thank you.
So if you would, for my colleagues, read this passage.
I'd be happy to. The history of slavery is the history of the United States. It was not peripheral to our founding, it was central to it. It is not irrelevant to our contemporary society, it created it. This history is in our soil, it is in our policies, it must too be in our memories. Across the United States and abroad, there are places whose histories are inextricably tied to the story of human bondage. Many of these places directly confront and reflect on their relationship to that history, and many of these places do not. But in order for our country to collectively move forward, it is not enough to have a patchwork of places that are honest about this history while being surrounded by other spaces that undermine it. It must be a collective endeavor to learn and confront the story of slavery and how it shaped the world we live in today. We can learn this history from the scholars who have unearthed generations of evidence of all that slavery was, from the voices of the enslaved in the stories and narratives they left behind, from the public historians who have committed themselves to giving society language to make sense of what's in front of them, from the descendants of those who were held in chains and the stories that have been passed down through their families across time, from the museums that reject the temptation of mythology and prioritize telling an honest and holistic story of how this country came to be, from the teachers who have pushed back against centuries of lies and who have created classrooms for their students where truth is centered, by standing on the land where it happened, by remembering that land, by marking that land, by not allowing what happened there to be forgotten, by listening to our own families, by sitting down and having conversations with our elders and getting insight into all that they've seen. At some point, it is no longer a question of whether we can learn this history, but whether we have the collective will to reckon with it.
The book has been out a year. What have you learned about our collective will? Do we have it? Will we reckon with this history?
You know, I've met so many people all over the course of this journey, both the journey of reporting and researching and writing the book, which was a sort of 4-year endeavor, and then the past year or so of talking to people from all across the country, all across the world. You know, the benefit of, you know, you try to find silver linings of this moment we've just had, and it's things like this, you know,
Yes.
things where I have a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old, so I'm, you know, unless I want to go into significant marriage debt, I don't. I have to limit my travel, and so you know what's been wonderful is that you know I can be in conversation with people in a different way because we built up this sort of virtual infrastructure in a way that allows for me to be in conversation with people. I've talked to people in Scotland and Australia and Argentina and Great Britain and France and Germany, all of these different places that would have been, you know, impossible for me to visit or spend any meaningful time with. And I think part of what I am discovering is that there are certainly people, and I've met many of these people, who have a sort of inherently antagonistic disposition when it comes to learning about, or not even necessarily learning about, but accepting this information. But I think there are more people who just don't know. There are more people who are not, because of the way that this history has been kept out of so many of our textbooks and our classrooms in a systemic and intentional way for so many decades, that many people will come to this information not knowing, because that's the same thing that happened with me, right? This book was not written by someone who began this project as an expert on the history of slavery. I began this project, as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, because I realized I didn't understand this history in a way that I should have. And what this book is not a polemic. This book is not intended to be didactic. This book is not intended to say, look at all these things that you should have always known. Like, why didn't you come out the womb reading Frederick Douglass? It's not that. It is, you are on a journey, a physical and intellectual and emotional journey alongside me. And, you know, part of what I tried to do is move with honesty and humility. And in the book reveal to the reader those moments where I'm learning something for the first time that I feel ashamed that I was learning about for the first time, or where I encounter something that was jarring to me, or something that was surprising or funny, or so I'm very central within the book, and I do believe that what has happened over the past 10 years, since the sort of beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2000, if we're thinking about the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement with the death of Trayvon Martin in 2012, that there has been a profound shift in public consciousness. That more people understand racism not just as an interpersonal phenomenon, but a systemic one, a structural one. I joke all the time with people that if you had asked somebody in 2012 what redlining was, a lot of people would have been like, is that part of Rihanna's makeup line?
And
Like,
we studied redlining,
yeah,
just so you know.
yeah. And I think people would have been like, what, is that a lipstick? Like redlining, what is that? But now more people recognize that as the mechanism through which housing segregation was perpetuated in the mid-20th century. And I think it's a microcosm of an expansion of people's historical sensibilities. What the activists and organizers on the ground in these different cities across the country have, much in the same way that happened during the Civil Rights Movement, opened up space for journalists and writers and artists and people like myself to sort of enter into, and to provide work that helps to provide a level of context as to what so many of these activists are fighting for, and what they are, and the sort of the context that illuminates the emergence of the systems that we recognize now as being harmful to so many of us. And so, and there's the same thing that happened during the Civil Rights Movement, where, people don't recognize necessarily now that up until the Civil Rights Movement, the way that most Americans understood slavery was that it was like a sort of, a sort of positive good. It was it was a benevolent institution. There were many good slave owners. They treated their enslaved property well. There was a sort of paternalistic institution. It says the sort of historian Ulrich B. Phillips, who was the primary historian around slavery in the early 20th century, he said that slavery was a civilizing institution, that it took Africans and took them away from the savagery of the continent and gave them culture, gave them religion, gave them
Absolutely.
Christianity, and used that as sort of justification of what it was. And that was the preeminent view of slavery until the 1950s, 1960s, where you had a generation of historians who came and were like, oh no, the story that this country has been telling about slavery is like fundamentally wrong, and began to be more honest about what slavery was, because as has often been the case, there was a sort of Orwellian distortion of what the institution actually was and the impact that it had on people. So all that's to say, I do think that we are in a different moment, but we also, what happens in moments of progress, especially when it comes to Black liberation, is that there's often, not even often, always intense pushback. Right. And I think we see that with the sort of critical race theory boogeyman that has been floating around our political discourse and within our electoral politics, which is unfortunate, but not unsurprising, because for many people, when you begin to tell a new story of this country, if their sense of themselves was tied to the previous story of America, a story that was less inclusive, less complex, less multidimensional, less holistic, less honest, their sense of who they believe themselves to be in the world is tied to the other story. And so it becomes a thing where it's not only, you're not only asking people to do a historical reassessment, it's becoming an existential crisis for people. Like, it becomes a crisis of identity. We're like, oh, well, like my grandfather told me this story, and you're telling me this story is wrong. And so now it's like you're questioning the history, but you're also questioning the integrity of my family.
Right.
And so it becomes like, it's not only an intellectual exercise, it's a deeply emotional one. It's tied to lineage, tied to family, tied to history, tied to community. And that's a hard thing for a lot of people to let go of.
Among your travels, you found yourself in Petersburg, Virginia, at Blandford Cemetery. Now, I was praying for you as I read this chapter at this cemetery, and up to 30,000 remains of Confederate soldiers are buried at Blandford Cemetery, and people come to visit Tiffany glass windows which adorn a particular chapel, and you had some struggle because the story of slavery was absent as you visited. But you chose to go back on Memorial Day to the Sons of Confederate Veterans celebration.
You did.
And you met a gentleman, Jeff, who fits what you just described. The story he told of the lost cause, of the South rising for heritage and family and patriotism and all that is good. That was the story Jeff held in his heart. And you walked up to him, Confederate emblems everywhere on his clothing, and engaged him in conversation. Could you hear his story? Could you value that it was his story? And what did you do in that moment? Because he rises out of what you just described.
Absolutely. Jeff that experience at spending the day with Sons Confederate Veterans, as I explained in the book, and as you can imagine, I was a conspicuous presence at such an event.
You said you were perspiring.
Yes, it was unsettling. It was jarring. But it was also incredibly clarifying, because as I kind of alluded to before, you recognize that for so many people, history is not about primary source documents or empirical evidence. It's a story that they're told, and it's a story that they tell. It's an heirloom that's passed down across generations. It's something where loyalty takes precedence over truth. You know, Jeff and I were having this conversation, and he was telling me about his grandfather, and there was this beautiful white gazebo at the center of the cemetery, and he told me how he and his grandfather, when he was a boy, used to come sit in that cemetery, and his grandfather would play him the old Dixie anthem on his banjo, and they would sing these songs about the great South, the great old South, and they would watch the sunset beyond the trees and watch the sky turn from blue to pink to orange to purple. They'd watch the fireflies emerge from the forest and watch the deer graze around the tombstones, these deeply sentimental and emotional memories he has of this moment. And as all of this is happening, his grandfather is saying, the men who were buried here didn't fight a war over slavery. The men who were buried here fought a war to protect themselves against northern invasion. The men who were buried here fought a war over states' rights and state sovereignty, and it had nothing to do with oppressing other people. It had everything to do with preserving the integrity of their communities and their families and the tradition of the Old South. And so now Jeff brings his granddaughters. You know, he talks about how he brings his granddaughters and he holds their hands and they walk through, and he tells his granddaughters the same stories that his grandfather told him. And for me, you know, if I'm going to tell Jeff, well, like, Jeff, you know, your grandfather said slavery had nothing to do with this war, but all you have to do is look at the Declarations of Confederate Secession, where a state like Mississippi in 1861 says, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. So these states aren't vague about why they're seceding from the Union. They wrote it down. Like, you can look at Alexander Stevens' Cornerstone speech.
It's in here.
It's in there. It's all in there. The vice president of the Confederacy, who said that no other nation on earth had been founded upon the great principle that the African was inferior to the white man, and that white people had the right to own slaves in perpetuity. And so, you know, there are all of these examples. But again, for Jeff, if Jeff is to accept that information, he would have to accept that his grandfather was lying to him.
Yes.
And if he accepts that his grandfather was lying to him, it threatens to disintegrate the foundation upon which his relationship with this person was built. And then again, it becomes like a crisis of identity. It's not just like, oh, well, you know, I guess the Declarations of Confederate Secession and all this contemporaneous evidence is correct. It's like, well, what, you know, if Grandpappy was lying about this, like, what else was I lied to about, right? And so much of their sense of, I mean, like, that is the most fundamental thing that orients us as we move through the world. It's like, and people find it through family, people find it through faith, people find it through work, people find it through all manner of things. But when you sort of crumble something that is foundational to who a person understands themselves to be, there's often pushback. And so I say all that, but the lack of acceptance is not inevitable. There are many people who have ancestors who fought for the Confederacy. I went to the Blandford with one. You know, one of my dearest friends. I'm going to be the best man in his wedding. A white guy named Billy Powers, who I went to graduate school with and also undergrad. He went to Blandford with me, in part because my wife was not going to let me go by myself.
Wise woman.
And then also because he was on his own sort of journey of confronting the fact that his ancestors were enslavers and fought for the Confederacy. And like, what does that mean to be a part of that lineage? But he's also someone who says, you know, well, my ancestors fought a war for a horrific, horrific thing. And I am also not defined by the decisions that my ancestors made. I can make a different set of decisions. I can condemn those decisions. And I can build, you know, the trajectory of my own family in a different direction with a different set of values. So it's not an inevitability that someone simply has to forever be tethered to the stories that they've been told. Just because someone tells you a story doesn't make that story true.
There is a story that connects to this for me that was so powerful for me in the book. It was Donna and Grace at Monticello.
Yeah.
And you tell the story of Monticello in this way, that you went and on that day participated in 2 tours. One that was focused on Monticello and slavery, and another on the Jefferson home. And as you were on the slavery tour, Donna and Grace were there with you, and you noticed them and walked up to them.
Yeah.
Now, the tour guide for that tour was a man named David. And I think it was Donna who said, "This man is just, he sort of messed me up. He's just opened my eyes."
Yeah.
And that, Clint, is one of the high points in the book for me, because here was this woman who came, I think, without a lot of knowledge, but who was positioned and willing to shift.
Yeah.
What happened to you as you entered to that conversation with Donna and Grace and realized that her gyroscope was shifting?
Yeah. It was such an important moment for me as a person, as the writer of this book. I mean, that was it's the first chapter of the book, but it's also one of the first chapters that was written. And there's a version of this book. This book went through sort of several different iterations in terms of what I imagined it was going to be. So at first, you know, I kind of gave the origin story about how it was connected to the monuments coming down. And at first I thought it would be, my second book would be my second poetry collection, and that the conceit would be that each poem would be about a different monument in New Orleans and what my relationship was to it. And so that's how the project began in many ways. And then I realized that the project needed a little bit more room to breathe. As someone who writes across genre, I try not to stay firmly anchored to a specific genre for any project, and kind of let the subject matter dictate the direction that I need to go, what discipline, what sort of intellectual tools need to be used, what artistic tools need to be used. And so it kind of went from a poem to a series of short essays, and then a sort of longer set of meditative comparative essays comparing different historical sites I visited. But I was not, you know, it's interesting because part of my narrative now is that I'm like this journalist, this like, you know, rough and tumble, like going to the Sons of Confederate Veterans event journalist. That was not, you know, I'm a writer at the Atlantic now, but I've only been there about 1.5 years, 2 years. That was not something that was a part of my toolkit, right? There was nothing in me. I'm a pretty introverted person at the end of the day, and it is not natural to my ethos to sort of walk up to people and walk up to strangers and ask them questions, especially walk up to white people on a plantation and ask them what they think about slavery. But I did it because I realized that if I was going to actually attempt to capture the complexity of public memory, that this book needed the voices of other people, right? That it needed to have the voices of people who were also on their own journeys, as I was on mine. And it was so, you know, I'll always remember when Donna was like, "Man, he really took the shine off the guy." She's like, "I had no idea Jefferson owned slaves. I had no idea Monticello was a plantation." And these are folks who bought plane tickets, rented cars, got hotel rooms, who came to this site as essentially a pilgrimage to see the home of one of our founding fathers, who came to see this place that for them had so much historical gravitas, and yet had no idea that it was plantation, had no idea he was an enslaver. And it was such an important moment for me to recognize both the you know, because these are conservative, Fox News watching, Republican voting, older white women. There's nothing in their sort of resume that would suggest that they would be open to engaging with this information. But that's part of what I love about these sites, because like Donna and Grace aren't. It is far less likely that they go to a bookstore and pick up How the Word is Passed than that they sort of stumble into Monticello and don't even realize they're on the Slavery at Monticello tour, and then have this sort of transformative 60-minute experience with this person who fundamentally recalibrates their understanding of who one of our founding fathers were. So it was very moving, and also was the catalyst for me to recognize that like this book had to be in part centered not only on the conceit of going to different places, but also talking to as many people as I could when I was in those places.
Dr. Ibrahim Asik is the curator or the director?
I think he's the director of research.
The director of research for the Whitney Plantation.
Yeah.
And the Whitney Plantation is the only plantation in New Orleans or in Louisiana that focuses on the perspective of the enslaved persons. Yeah. There's a quote that he offers, and he says that the Whitney Plantation is this book open up under the sky.
It was very hard for me not to make that the title.
Yes.
It was the role, what the Whitney has to be in other museums like it have to be are these open books under the sky.
Under the sky.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about the immersive nature of visiting places, that I am without the protection of sitting at home with my book. I am without the safeguards of being in a classroom out of which I can walk at any moment. I have put myself at the Whitney or in any of these 8 places that you visited. And I'm curious, because you wrote a book, I'm curious what the bridge is to an immersive place. How do we, because people are changed in these immersive moments, something is broken open. What's the bridge to those immersive moments, those immersive places? How do we do more of this in our nation?
Yeah, I mean, the irony is that I wrote a book about how important it is to visit places. But there is something so dynamic about physically being in spaces where this history happened. Nothing can replicate the experience of standing inside a slave cabin at the Whitney Plantation and listening to the way the wood moaned as you stepped across the floor, and seeing the cracks in the wood in the roof and on the wall, and thinking about how susceptible to the elements these families would have been, thinking about how small it was relevant to the big house right down the road, thinking of how many families were here, how many families lived here, built memories there, were separated from one another there. And for me, the part of the point of the book is to give us a sense of our collective physical proximity to this history, and how the scars of slavery are etched into the landscape all around us. But in doing so, I think what it also does is gives us a sense of our temporal proximity to this history, right? When I'm standing in a cabin that enslaved people once lived in, I'm reminded that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago truly wasn't that long ago at all. Walking through the National Museum of African American History and Culture with my grandparents, I think about my grandfather born in 1930, Jim Crow, Mississippi, my grandmother born in 1939, Jim Crow, Florida, and I'm pushing my grandfather in a wheelchair, and we're walking past all these exhibits, and I'm looking at them, looking at the things on the walls, and realizing that so much of what is documented on these walls are things that they experienced firsthand. And I think about the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a woman named Ruth Bonner, who rang the bell to open it at open the museum alongside the Obama family in 2016. And she's the daughter. She was the daughter. She recently passed. She was the daughter of an enslaved person, right? Not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter, a woman who opened the Museum of National African American History and Culture was the daughter of an enslaved person. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. When I think about my 4-year-old son sitting on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And it fundamentally disabuses you of the idea that this was somehow something that happened in the distant past. There are still people alive today who knew, who loved, who were raised by people who were born into bondage. And so the idea that we would suggest that this history has nothing to do with the contemporary landscape of inequality, that we would suggest that the residue of it has no impact on our social, political, and economic infrastructure is revealed to be morally and intellectually disingenuous. And I think that that acute sense of my proximity, a new acute sense of my proximity to that history emerges from the places that I spent time, because you feel the history in your bodies. And if I had not gone to these places, I don't think I would have even been pushed to interview my grandparents in like a formal way to get a sense of, and as I write in the book, it helps me recognize that sometimes the best primary sources are the people right next to us. Sometimes you don't have to go visit a plantation somewhere. Sometimes you can, talk to your elder who lived through a fundamentally different period of American history than you have. And I think that there's so much value in that. And that, all of that stems from, going to these places and putting my feet in the sort of proverbial sand.
You talk about our proximity to slavery, and I only put the book down once.
It's a lot of listening.
I was driving to New Jersey and back. It was fabulous.
Okay.
I put the book down when I read that at the start of the Civil War in 1861, the 4 million enslaved persons were worth $3.5 billion. I did the math. In today's dollars, it's $114 billion.
Worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined.
And so so my grandfather was born in 1885. So within the lifetime of my mother's father, the wealth that black bodies brought to America and the labor of black bodies built the system, the economic system in which we operate now. So our proximity to slavery exists with every dollar that is exchanged in this nation now. When you found that fact, when you came across that economic engine that was the enslaved labor of our nation, what happened to you? I put the book down. What happened to you?
It's a staggering figure. I mean, it's staggering to consider that the bodies of 4 million enslaved people were worth more than all the manufacturing of the entire country combined. I mean, if one did not believe, it's interesting because so much of this book was in some ways giving me more specific empirical evidence that built upon what were sort of proverbs or axioms or things that like you hear people say, right? Like I grew up around elders who like this country was built on black people's backs. It's something so many of us say, like it was built on the backs of enslaved people. And you're like, okay, like I understand that and then at some point it almost becomes a metaphor, and it's like, well, like what does that mean? And then you see this and you're like, this is what it means, right? I mean, it is impossible to understand the United States as a global economic superpower today without understanding how that trajectory would have been impossible without 250 years of enslaved labor. We had slavery in this country, or in the British colonies would become this country between 1619 and 1865, over 250 years, and have only not had it for a little over 150.
Right.
So you have this institution that existed for a century longer than it hasn't. And again, it goes back to like, how can one encounter that information that only a few generations ago enslaved people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined, and then suggest that that history has nothing to do with what our society looks like today? You can't square those two things. And so that, you know, if the reader leaves the book with one thing, my hope is that it is a more acute sense of that, of our collective proximity to that history, and how we have to recognize the way that it fundamentally shaped the foundation upon the economic, social, political, the existence of the Electoral College, the existence of the Senate as it stands, the existence of you know, the manifestations of so many policies. This book is just about slavery. It doesn't even go into some of the things it sounds like you all have talked about: the history of housing segregation, the history of redlining, the history of, you know, all the healthcare, all the policies that were created to provide white Americans with the opportunities for upward mobility to shift the trajectory of their lives. How the New Deal, you know, was the single greatest catalyst of intergenerational wealth over the course of a century. But black people didn't have access to the benefits. Black people didn't have access to Social Security, minimum wage protection, housing mortgages, healthcare, many parts of the GI Bill. So you give the greatest catalyst of intergenerational wealth over the course of a century to one group of people, and you don't give it to a different group of people. And then people want to act surprised generations later when there are disparate outcomes along the lines that these resources were allotted. Those things are compounding the original theft of people's bodies and labors and time. And so that, you know, for me, it's just like, it goes back to that Baldwin quote from the essay. It was like, I feel like we tell young people all the time, especially young black people, like black children, how important it is to work hard, how important it is to overcome, how important it is to persevere, to have grit, and all of those things are important. But if you're only telling a young person to work hard and overcome, and not giving them the context to understand why the systems that have created the reality that they have to overcome in the first place, then you make it seem as if that young person has to overcome themselves rather than overcome decades of policy and legislation and laws that have shaped what their communities look like today. And I just think that that's so important. And it's so important, you know, I'm also mindful of the folks we're in conversation with today. It's as important for young white children, right? Because it's essential for white people to be cognizant of, you know, while it is liberating for me, but I think it can also be liberating for white people to recognize that the communities that they live in, the material goods that they have, the resources they've been afforded, are not singularly due to a sort of notion of moral desert, are not singularly due to what someone deserves because of their hard work. It's not to say that one doesn't work hard, because sometimes people can hear it and be like, well, my grandfather worked hard. I worked hard. Undoubtedly. But if you have, you know, a young person who grows up in one community, a young person who grows up in another community, they can both work equally as hard. But if the social infrastructure and the economic and resource infrastructure in their respective lives look different, then the way that hard work manifests itself will look different. And that's what we're asking people to recognize. It's ultimately a sort of historical humility, right? To sort of look back and say, oh, this is not just due to my hard work. This is due to something much bigger than me. And then for that to then push someone to ask themselves, what then are my responsibilities to attempt to build the sort of world in which one's trajectory is not so drastically shaped by the circumstances, the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance.
There was a particular, so when I hear you talk about different communities understanding the different trajectories and the ways in which their lives are formed, One of the conversations that got my attention was with, this is Galveston, on Galveston Island. There's a woman named Kathy. She was, as you described her, I'm guessing a lot like me, sort of an older, I'm not an older white woman, but older woman.
Elegant.
Why, thank you, elegant, who was working to get the children prepared for a particular portion of the Juneteenth celebration at Galveston. And your engagement with her included language that people have to care about one another's stories. That if you can enter into someone's story, if you can care about another's story, and it sounded to me like she was saying, how do we soften the edges of people's stories so we can get proximate with one another? That I don't have to tell you, I don't have to start with that's a lie, but I can start with I am interested in your story. That's what I thought of when you encountered Jeff. You were interested in his story.
Yeah.
How do we release sometimes the anger, sometimes the frustration that comes with that uneven trajectory, enough so I can be interested in someone else's story?
It can be hard. You know, I certainly am not, I don't think that it is every black person's or person of color responsibility to walk up to, you know, members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and engage them in conversation more, or attempt to convince them of something or teach them something, or anyone for that matter. I mean, for me, this book was, I tried to model the sensibilities of this book after so many of the public historians and the docents and the tour guides that I met. You know, when you go to Monticello and spend time with David, when you go to Whitney, spend time with Yvonne, when you go to New York City, spend time with Damaris, when you go to Angola, spend time with Norris, you know, these aren't folks who are gonna judge you for what you don't know. There's this sort of both andness to the way they do things. There's they extend a remarkable level of grace and generosity, which is to say that when you show up, there's not going to be any sort of condescension. There's not going to be any sort of like, can't believe you didn't know this already. There's not going to be any sort of like, what's wrong with you? How come you're just figuring this out for the first time? It's like there's a recognition that this information is being provided to you, and there is also the expectation of accountability and responsibility, where we're going to share this information for you, and there's not going to be any judgment, but there is the expectation that once we present it to you, you're going to sit with that, and you're going to hold that, and you're going to wrestle with that, even if it is jarring, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it runs counter to all the information and all the stories you've been told previously your entire life. And my hope is that that is what I can do, you know, that is what the book is doing. It's saying, like, it's an invitation to come spend time with these stories, to come learn about these things I'm also learning about. And so I try to, you know, and I'm not always perfect at it. I'm human. There are moments where I am less gracious and less generous than I want to be. But I recognize that so much of what I have come to learn in the world, beyond this subject matter, across a range of issues, is because people have extended grace and generosity to me when they didn't need to, but they did it anyway. And I try my best to live my life in a way that extends grace and generosity to people in the way that grace and generosity has often been extended to me. And I just try to wake up every day and do that the best that I can.
You are a poet, and grace and generosity are in your language and in your being. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is transformative. So Jess, I do believe you have some questions. I have been able to take this time with Clint, but it is your turn, my sister.
Thank you, Zena. Thank you, Clint. Clint, thank you so much for your time with us. One One of the questions I have is from one of our viewers is, have you ever had a reader's response that has really stayed with you? Either a positive reaction that has meant a lot to you personally, or one with a more negative impact?
You know, I feel enormously lucky. I haven't gotten a lot of negative email. I mean, you know, there's a handful, but overwhelmingly, the messages I've received have been incredibly positive, incredibly affirming, incredibly generous. You know, it's interesting. You know, some of the things I enjoy most are the intergenerational conversations that the book has seemed to become a catalyst to. People who said, I read this with my grandfather. You know, I read this with my grandmother who only watches Fox News, or who only, you know, listens to, you know, the conservative talk radio, or who only, who doesn't ever want to talk about issues of race, who thought Black Lives Matter was, you know, a terrorist group, and all these things, and that you know, this young person, someone my age, you know, would or younger would read this book and then invite their loved one to read it alongside them, and that it might serve as an entry point for a deeper sense of empathy, a shared sense of understanding
Yes.
about these issues and the history from which they emerge. I've loved stuff like that. I also love people who visited some of these sites, but at different periods of time. And so I get a lot of messages from people who visited Monticello 10, 20, 30 years ago, who were like, man, when I visited Monticello in 1987, like, nobody whispered anything about Jefferson and slavery, right? Nobody said the word Sally Hemings. Nobody. And so I think I like that in part because it reflects the way that these institutions and these sites aren't static, right? And that just like us, they have the capacity to change and to evolve and to tell a better version of themselves. I think Monticello is an example of a place that has done a lot of evolution in terms of how they tell the story about Jefferson. I mean, they were among the most fervent deniers as an institution of the fact that Jefferson may have possibly been the father of enslaved his own children, which we know based on the writings of Annette Gordon Reed, and we know based on the DNA test that came back a few decades ago that Jefferson was undeniably the father of Sally Hemings' children. And so, you know, I really love moments where someone says, I visited this place in 1990 or 1985, and now you make me want to go back because I feel like they're being more honest with themselves, and maybe I should be more honest with myself. So yeah, it's been, you know, so many people write books that are remarkable and so powerful that never reach the readership that they deserve. So I feel endlessly grateful and lucky that this book has gotten such a wide readership, and that people have engaged with it with the kindness and generosity that they have.
Another question that was sent online is, how do you broach this conversation or respond when it arises with someone you believe to be highly motivated by protecting their sense of self based on what they've learned or been told about our history over the course of their lives?
Yeah, I mean, so much of this depends on the person, like, and so much of it depends on what sort of how committed you are to having that conversation with them, or attempting to change their mind in the first place. I do not have any sort of intellectual or scholarly or artistic commitments that attempt to convince someone of something that they don't want to believe. That's just not how I want to spend my time on this earth. I'm happy to be in conversation with people who are curious, people who are thoughtful, people who may have questions, but it's different when you're talking to somebody who is entering the space from the premise that, like, I don't want to believe what you have to say. And then we're already in a moment where people attempt to turn empirical statements into ideological ones, right? So if I say the Confederacy was a treasonous territory that raised an army predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery, in many places across the country today, that would be seen as something that is reflective of my political disposition, or my ideological beliefs, rather than something that is an empirical fact, rather than something that is in the primary source documents themselves. And it's this attempt to distort truth and turn truth into ideology. And it is being wielded as a political weapon in our discourse today. So, you know, my answer to that is that I don't spend a lot of time trying to convince people of something. I'm not sure if you all were here when we talked about the Sons of Confederate Veterans, but I am curious. You know, I move through those spaces with curiosity. I want to understand like how someone comes to believe so deeply in lost cause propaganda, how someone comes to believe in information that is so clearly untrue. But you know, I didn't go to the Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration to try to convince them to believe something that runs counter to their entire sort of ethos. I went to try and understand. So I guess it depends on people's commitments. That might look different if it's, you know, a family member or if it's something else. And I think the only thing I can say with that is, as difficult as it may be, the only way that they are going to listen to you is if you approach from a non-judgmental space, which is hard when you're talking about issues that are fundamentally harmful to large groups of people. But if someone feels like they're being attacked or judged from the moment you enter that conversation, then it's not going to manifest itself as anything meaningful.
Thank you. Todd, you have a question?
Former city council.
I did have a question because when I was a freshman in high school, our teacher, English teacher, gave us out a little pamphlet to order books, and I sent in my money order, and one of the books I ordered and bought was the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I found it a very fascinating book, but I have to say that it took me a while to get through the parts of the speeches. I was, after a while, of being referred to as a white devil, you know. But I came to a realization much later after having read the book, I mean, years later, and that's my question, do you think his speeches were more of trying to break the mesmerism of a white society to the audience that he was speaking to? Because I kind of feel like, you know, that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Malcolm was emerging out of a moment where people were fundamentally disillusioned with the idea that they should simply turn the other cheek and accept what white people were doing to them on both an interpersonal and a structural and a systemic level. And he was one of the, you know, he sort of built the foundational principles of Black power. You know, so much of, Malcolm was mostly speaking to Black people. Like that was his primary audience were Black people, and it was an attempt to both politically, socially, and culturally reaffirm them, right? Sort of, right, like you don't have to believe the things that people tell you about what you are capable of. You don't have to believe the things that people say about what you look like and how that doesn't fit into the sort of aesthetic of what people consider to be beautiful. You don't have to accept the idea that, you know, you should have to go to the back of a restaurant where the dogs are being held, where the dumpster is sitting next to you in order to be served. And so he is part of the Black nationalist tradition, which said, you know, we don't have to continue to subject ourselves to this politically, socially, economically, and we can make a different set of decisions. And historically, Malcolm, you know, Malcolm was human, and there were things that he said that were wrong, and things that he sort of disavowed later in his life. Who Malcolm was in 1962, you know, is different than who Malcolm was in 1955. You know, it's like part of the thing about historical figures that I think is so important. And when I was a teacher, and whenever I'm talking about these things more broadly, is we mentioned that, you know, historical sites are not static, but neither are historical figures, right? You know, one of the people I admire most is Abraham Lincoln. And it's not just because I see Lincoln as like the great emancipator, because the story is far more complex than that. What I admire about Lincoln is like who he was in 1850 is not who he was in 1865.
Right.
And that Lincoln had a lot of evolution. And some of the things Lincoln said about Black people in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, when he was running for Congress, when he was saying, you know, I don't like slavery, but we should send Black people to another colony. I would never want daughter to marry a black person. Black
be
people shouldn't
equal.
serve on juries. Black
Right.
people aren't inherently equal. And that's the thing about, you know, that's the part of the thing about telling a more complicated story is people tend to think that like if you were anti-slavery, you were equal rights. But a lot of people were anti-slavery, but also I don't want to live next to a black person. So it was like, let's end slavery, but also send them somewhere else. Which black people, the majority of black people fundamentally rejected because they were like, I've been here for 7 generations. This is my home, right? I've been here longer than a lot of y'all, right? A lot of y'all just showed up off the boat from Ireland and Italy. And, you know, so there's like a question of like what American is and who America belongs to. But I say all that to say, you know, Malcolm is an important historical figure because like some of the things that he was saying in those early speeches are unsettling and are things that feel jarring. But it also is not necessarily reflective of who he was toward the end of his life. And I think it, you know, what I admire about Lincoln was his capacity to evolve. What I admire about Malcolm was his capacity to evolve. What I admire about Dr. King was his capacity to evolve, right? The way that his framework around justice focused primarily on race and then evolved into a sort of larger geopolitical, with a geopolitical ethos, where his condemnation of imperialism, with a recognition of the nature of class and socioeconomic status in its relationship to race and racism. So, you know, the people I admire most are the people who are able to look back at some of the things that they might have once said and say that was wrong. Because that's what all of us do, right? Like that's what it means to be a human. I think like all of us try to wake up and be a better version of ourselves. I'm ashamed of beliefs that I held 10 years ago. I'm ashamed of some things that I believed and thought, you know, 15 years ago. But part of what we do is we try to get up every day, as I've been saying, with curiosity, with humility, and to move with empathy. And that is proactive work. That's not something that happens passively. That's something that you have to wake up every day and make a decision to sort of work toward the version of yourself that you want to be. Because who we want to be and who we sometimes think we are is not always necessarily aligned with who we actually are and the decisions that we actually make. And so part of the goal of, you know, I think to my mind, what it means to be human is to try each day to move a little bit closer to the version of ourselves that we want to be.
I think you belong in Courageous Community. Can you move to Barrington and hang out with us?
Wait now, hold on, Jess. Hold on, hold on. I
Zena,
see
you're
who's
welcome to
standing
come
next-
back. I mean, come on.
Why, thank you. Thank you. I see who's standing next to you.
Yes, I'm going to have our Courageous Community member and fellow Abigail ask a question.
Clint, something that you said was, in moments of progress and especially Black liberation, there is always intense pushback. And you referenced that a couple times about how sometimes people have an inherently antagonistic disposition. So in those moments when there's so much vitriol, what gives you hope? Like, what gives you hope that there are going to be more people who do believe that understanding the correct version of history is the right thing to do? So yeah, I guess just what gives you hope?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think all the time about how the first enslaved people came to the British colonies that would become this country in 1619, and how slavery didn't end until 1865. What that means is that, you know, from the moment enslaved people arrived on these shores, they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for liberation. They were fighting for their right to not be someone else's property. But that also means that the vast majority of people who fought for freedom never got a chance to see it. But that doesn't mean that what they worked for was for nothing, because my life is only possible because of people who fought for something they knew they might never see, but fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. And I think about what sort of responsibility does that bestow upon me in the way that I live my life, right? This recognition that millions of people fought for something they knew they might never see so that I might experience it, so that my children might experience it. And so what does it mean to be part of that tradition, to be part of that lineage, and to attempt to build a better world, even if it means I might not get to experience some of the fruits of that labor myself? But I think we do it because that's what people have always done for us. And in so many ways, that's part of the the black cultural tradition, you know, and in so many ways that's part of the human tradition, right? I think I think about, it's like we're chipping away at this wall, and you don't know if that wall is 6 inches thick or 6,000 miles thick. But you know, the more you chip away at it, the less the people who come after you will have to chip away at. And ultimately, one day, and we don't know when, we will see the light on the other side of that wall. And somebody will have that final chip that breaks down the wall and it makes the entire thing crumble. And so for me, you know, I'm here to do all I can to chip away at that wall. And I think that that's what, I have hope because people before me had hope. And their hope is what makes it so that we're able to sit here in the first place. And so who am I to not have hope that I might be able to do something similar in even in a small, minute, granular way for some people far down the road that will look back, you know, at what we did in the same way we look back at what the folks who came before us did.
Thank you. A question from a viewer online is, you mentioned earlier the importance of our community, in particular our white students having the ability to learn accurate history, which does indeed speak to the realities of slavery and the founding of America. How can we help our parents and community understand that, especially when the information is perceived as fundamentally harmful?
I mean, it's hard. It's hard because, as we've said a couple times throughout this conversation, it's not only like, you're not only asking people to engage in an intellectual transformation, you're often asking people to engage in like a transformation, like a fundamental transformation of how they understand themselves in relation to the world. I think we do our best to continue to reject the conflation of truth and indoctrination, right? I think that, so, you know, I think about Thomas Jefferson. We talked a little bit about Monticello. When I think about Jefferson, if I am going to be intellectually honest about who Jefferson was, you have to sit with the complexity of who that man was. He was someone who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also someone who enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including four of his own children who lived into adulthood. He is someone who wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia that he suspects black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. Said the slave was incapable of love, that the slave was incapable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion. Wrote about Phyllis Wheatley, the first, you know, the sort of founding mother of the black literary tradition, the first black woman to publish a book in the history of the United States. He said that her work was, quote, below the dignity of criticism, that it wasn't even worth engaging with because black people didn't have the emotional capacity or bandwidth with which to create art. He said that love is the ostrom of the poet, which is to say that in order to create art, in order to create poetry, he believed that you had to experience and understand the emotional texture of what love was. And he didn't believe that black people could do that. So thus he didn't believe black people were capable of creating art. And so when I'm thinking about Jefferson, I can not only understand Jefferson as a scholar, a statesman, a president, a founder, without also understanding who he was as an enslaver, without also wrestling with what does it mean, the complexity and the sort of cognitive dissonance of his intellectual project, where he knew slavery was wrong. He wrote extensively about it. He said slavery was more harmful to the enslaver than it was to the enslaved. It's depraved
And
what
our
we do.
children will come and ask us.
And they're like, how could we do that?
Yes.
And yet, he owned enslaved people throughout his entire life, separated enslaved people from their families upon his death to pay off his debts, separated families during when he was alive, had people beaten, had people tortured. And so for me, asking students to sit with the totality of who a person was, that's not indoctrination. That's not I'm not sitting here saying like Jefferson was so evil, you have to think he's evil too. One, that's not what teachers are doing largely, and that's also bad pedagogy. What teachers are doing, what I think what we're asking people to do, is to say, let's not ignore this entire facet of who Jefferson was. Let's not only talk about him as one of the intellectual founding fathers of this country or the drafter of the Declaration of Independence. Let's talk about who he was in totality and to sit with the messiness of that. Because I think if we can wrestle with and hold the complexity and messiness of someone like Jefferson, then we're more able to hold the complexity and messiness of America as it exists today. And we will be less tempted to try to fit things into sort of neatly demarcated sections and boxes. And we will recognize that that our country is a complicated, messy place. And Jefferson, why I went to Monticello, is because I think Jefferson is a sort of a microcosm for America, where America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined. And it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. It's not one over here or one over there. It's not that one is true and the other's not. They're both true. And we have to hold that at the same time. And that's ultimately what this is all about, right? It's saying we've told a very myopic, narrow story of this country for so long. And now it's time to tell the fuller version of it. Now it's time to include the voices and perspectives that have for so long been left out. And it's hard for people because it's hard to be told that, again, we keep coming back to it, like the nationalistic foundation upon which you have come to identify yourself is more complex than you maybe understood it to be. But that's what we have to do. I think that's our duty.
Thank you. I have someone patiently waiting to ask a question over here in person. Dave?
Thank you, Jess, for all you do. Clint, you're amazing. I appreciate your good words, and I appreciate the hope that you've got. Keep chipping away at it, all right? So first, before I ask my question, Carol, my wife, and my daughter Claire and I were at the Whitney Foundation, or Whitney Plantation, a day that you were also there researching your book. My daughter spied you with your notebook before, and we knew what you were writing about. So now we know. So
Wow.
Thank you.
You
I don't know
bet.
if you knew that, but
Really?
that's a memory that we have.
That is amazing.
All right. And I highly recommend next time you're in New Orleans, for anybody, please stop by the Whitney Plantation. It's an amazing place. All right, my question. A little different than the other questions we've got. My daughter is a big fan of yours and told me you are a huge soccer fan. So I want to know what your favorite team is, and have you seen any interesting youth programs that use sports to learn about history and diversity? Thank you.
Interesting. My favorite team is Arsenal. It's a soccer team in London. It's interesting that my life looks like this now, because if you would ask me between age 5 and 18, I would have been like, I'm 100% becoming a professional soccer player.
see.
No question. It was so clear to me. I was doing all the extracurriculars that, parents sign their kids up for. I was playing piano, and I was like, Mom, I have to quit piano. She was like, why are you going to quit piano? Because she was like, I have to dedicate all my time to soccer. And she was like, I think you might want to grow up and know how to sit down and play the piano. I think you might regret this. I was like, I won't regret it. I'm going to be a millionaire. I'm going to be a superstar. I'm going to be a soccer star in London, just like, the face of American soccer. And then you grow up and you realize that Louisiana is not a hotbed of soccer talent against which to measure your skills on a global level. So I was very good in high school. All state, all city, all metro, and we won a state championship. But then I got to college. I played at Davidson College, where Steph Curry is our most famous alumni. We were in the same class actually, and he's a good friend. But my experience with athletics was very different at Davidson than Steph Curry's. I rode the bench most of college. And I had my own, we've been talking about existential crises. I had my own sort of 18, 19-year-old identity crisis, because this thing that had defined me my entire life, I was no longer good at anymore. And I had to really figure out, what do I care about outside of soccer? what am I passionate about? And I feel very lucky that I was at a school like Davidson that gave me the space to sort of figure out who I was beyond the soccer field, you know, that I could become one of the editors on the school paper, that I could start a poetry club, that I could do Big Brothers Big Sisters, that I could do voter registration drives, that I could join a fraternity, that I could do all these other pieces that gave me a sense of who I was and who I was trying to become. And that's how I found writing, because I tried to, I redirected my competitive energy into the space of slam poetry, which is, people who aren't familiar, is it's basically like a performance poetry competition. It was very big when I was in college and afterwards, and I sort of put all my athletic energy into that space, and it is impossible to understand my life as a full-time writer now from, you know, those late night open mics when, you know, your friends come and they probably had a little too much to drink on a Thursday night, and they're like, yeah, and I look back and I'm like, man, those poems were terrible, but I appreciate the support of my dear friends who probably remember nothing of what I was saying, but yeah, I love soccer. I've loved it my entire life. I'm a huge fan. I recently just started playing again after, you know, not playing throughout the pandemic, and you know, I'm in my 30s now, and it's a, you know, your body. It's funny to play the game you love when your body does not move in the way that you remember it moving, and so it's humbling. I'm a lot more sore the next day than I have been in the past, but yeah, I love it, and I'm excited for the World Cup this summer. I do a little bit of soccer writing with The Atlantic, and I'm planning on doing some stuff for the World Cup, so that'll be fun. And in terms of organizations that do work around history and soccer, I don't know specifically about history. I know that DC Scores here in the DC area does some really great work around like after-school programming, education, soccer, and poetry, actually. Like DC Scores sort of foundational principle is they go into public schools and they play soccer and write poetry, which sounds like it's something that was like made. I was like, did I found this organization? Did I not realize it? But I love the work that they do. And I actually lived in South Africa after I graduated from college for a year, working for an organization called Grassroots Soccer, which uses soccer as a tool to fight HIV/AIDS in different cities and townships around South Africa. So I'm always interested in like the way that, you know, we can use sports or as an entry point to thinking about a broader set of historical or social issues. Because it is, you know, I think it's trite to say it's like the great unifier, but it does build bridges in ways that few other things do.
Thank you so much. A comment from Jamin Jordan. He just wants you to know that this was a great discussion. So much of what Clint said resonated with him, and a lot of it were things he has said almost exactly word for word. He is always invigorated to see and hear other people doing this work, and he wants you to know that you are not alone in the work. So just a little message of encouragement. We have a question from Wendy.
Hi, Clint. My name is Wendy. I'm also from New Orleans. I can relate to a lot of the things that you were talking about. And I was very involved with Denver Scores when I lived in Denver. It's a national organization. There's probably a Chicago Scores as well. But thank you so much for your great and thoughtful conversation. We talk a lot about having the conversation, but then, you know, taking it one step forward. If we all educate ourselves and we all agree that slavery was a huge problem for our history and our nation, where do you see us going from there? If we can all agree that it was really bad, how do we make it right?
I mean, I think part of it, thank you for your question. I think part of it is like getting everybody on the same page on that issue, because I don't know that everybody would even agree with the statement that you shared, and that's part of the problem. Part of the issue is that we don't have a collective understanding of the horror of that institution and what it wrought. I mean, you know, one example, and we've talked a little bit about this. You know, one of the things about going to physical places is that it really stretches your empathic muscles. And so, you know, I thought about slavery for so long, largely through the prism of like the spectacle of cruelty, and in a sort of like heteronormative way that was like, it's a man being beaten with a whip. Like that is the first thing that would come to mind, and that's in part because that is what those are so many of the images in our films and documentaries and all the things about the institution. And what I had not spent a lot of time thinking of until I started writing this book and until I had children was the project of family separation. And I always remember being at the Whitney and being in that cabin. And that was after having been at the exhibit where it's the Field of Angels and all the children who have been, who died during, in infancy. And I did this exercise where I just I kind of closed my eyes and I imagined what it would be like if I were in my home and I woke up the next day and my children were gone. I had no idea where they went. I had no idea if I would ever see them. I had no idea who had taken them. And you realize that this was the omnipresent threat that millions of people across generations lived under every single day of their lives. It feels unfathomable, right? It feels like something I can't even fully engage in the thought exercise because it feels so viscerally upsetting. And yet for 2.5 centuries, that was the threat that enslaved people lived under, right? Like that was the thing that was wielded above them, sort of hung over them like a sort of psychological and emotional terror. Where like, you might try to escape, but you know, what's gonna happen to your family? Like the implications and repercussions for your actions extend beyond you. And that at any moment, somebody can separate you from your wife, from your husband, from your parents, from your children, from your loved ones, from your community. And you see this in the information wanted ads at the end of the Civil War, where you see family, like people putting ads in the newspaper, where it's like, you know, I haven't seen my husband in 30 years, but you know, the last time I saw him, he looked like this, and I think he got sent to Georgia. If anybody has any information, please let me know. Last time I saw my mother was 32 years ago, and she had short hair and beautiful brown eyes, and if anybody knows, I think she was in Tennessee. If anybody, you know, I mean, just so many people searching for their loved ones. And so I bring that up in part because I don't think that I just don't think that people have a sense of like what it was, you know, like I don't think we all get beyond its economic implications, beyond its political implications, which we've outlined in this conversation, just like the familial, the interpersonal consequences of this thing. And again, like we have to remind ourselves that this wasn't that long ago. We're not imagining something that was like millennia ago. There are people alive today who knew, who loved, and were raised by people who were born as chattel and told that they were someone else's property and lived under the very sort of indescribable terror that we're describing. We are so proximate to that, right? So when we imagine that, we should imagine ourselves. Like, what would we do if we were in that position? And I think it just becomes so much more real to you when you really say, like, how would I move through the world? Like, what would life look like if this were something that I was subjected to? Because again, people in this world today knew people who were subjected to this. So I think that, you know, to the extent possible, and I hope this book is one small contribution in that direction, that people just get a more acute and intimate sense of what it was, so that they can, you know, so that we can have a more honest conversation with it to begin with.
Wendy, you'll remember one of our earlier presentations when Steve Pagan was speaking to us. He talked to us about noticing who was absent in the room. That one of the things we can do is to recognize how we've been divided from one another. And so just who's not present, whose voice is not being heard, whose perspective is absent. And in any conversation of import, what's missing because they're missing. That's a simple thing, each of us. He also said in that presentation that our net work is our net worth. And so, what's the worth that each of us, has in our networks that we work to be sure we recognize who is or is not present, so that that point of view can be known, that part of the story can be told.
Thank you, Zena, for reminding us of some of those earlier days of Courageous Community. I have another question for you from Terrence.
Hello, thank you. First of all, I think tonight has been fantastic. The conversation, the part that we were privileged to participate in. My question tonight is, after all of the research and the facts that you've been able to obtain, in the knowledge base that you have, that you've shared with us so kindly in your book, how do you now extend a bridge with people who have a different perspective than the facts that you've been able to obtain?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I just do my best to, as I said, extend the sort of generosity to folks that has often been extended to me. I know that there are multiple issues that I was ignorant of, that I had limited understanding of, that I may have talked about in ways that were previously, that would have been offensive to people, that people would have considered and felt as being harmful. And I think that what I tried to do was remember what people did for me, or the grace and the generosity they extended to me in those moments, and do my best to extend a similar sort of grace and generosity to others. And it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work because it's hard. It doesn't always work because the other person's not always trying to hear it. And that's okay. You know, we can only control what we can control, right? And for me, and I tell you, when I talk to students, I talk about this all the time, but like, it goes back to the beginning of our conversation where I didn't write this book to change anyone's mind. I didn't write this book to try to convince people to believe something. I wrote this book because this is what a younger version of me needed to read. This is what I needed to understand for myself. And I think in some ways, it's a similar thing where you're on a journey, not so that you can necessarily convince others, but so that you can have a more acute sense of who you are in relation to the world, and to be the best version of you, which I think at its best has a sort of contagious effect, I think. And I think, this community is emblematic of that, right? It's a lot of people who recognize within themselves that there are things that they don't understand, that they could know better, that they, that are trying to, as we said, trying to get them closer to the version of themselves, the version of ourselves that we want to be. And it's a beautiful thing when you can do that in community. But you also can't do it with the intention of then being able to wield it like a weapon, even if it's with good intentions. Because then you're losing sight of what it means to do it for yourself. Because as I said, for me, there's something incredibly liberating and emancipatory about this. And that's not because of anything that I'm convinced or don't convince other people of. It's because of the level of clarity that I have for myself now that I didn't have before.
So as a parent of 2 children myself, and you are a dad of 2 kids as well, what I love about your story, about how you've written this for your younger self, and that it has been liberating for you. My journey through my own awareness and understanding of our history and what it means to be a white woman in that history has been extremely liberating for myself, and I continue to be very interested in being on that journey for my children's sake. And I'd love to know, for your kids, what do you imagine how do you see them walking in the world with this knowledge so much earlier than you? And what do you wish for the next generations to be able to do with it?
Yeah, it's they're so funny. They're just like silly kids. And what I want for them is, we have a lot of children's books, and we have the books that are the children's biographies of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, and 1619 Project Children's books, and all the books about Dr. King and Malcolm X and Rosa Parks. And they provide a great entry point to thinking about and talking about that history, and to being honest about that history, and about understanding in a developmentally and age-appropriate way, the socio-political and historical context that their lives emerge from. And so I want my children to understand this history. I want them desperately to understand this history, because I think there's, as we said, so much liberation, something emancipatory about that. I also don't want my children who think that their race, their lives, their culture is singularly defined by violence and oppression. And so we have the books of Harriet Tubman and Dr. King, and we also have the books of the little black girl who wants to be a rocket scientist, and the little black boy who wants to be a dinosaur, and the little, and the kids with brown faces who love like playing with slime, playing with slime and jumping on the moon, and because I want them to have both an intimate understanding of their past and an expansive understanding of their future, and of their possibilities. And so it's as we've kind of been saying a lot, there's a both andedness to it, right? Like I want young people to look at this country and say, this country is a remarkable place that has also done some horrific things. And it can be both of those. And I want them to say, this country is not static. This country is not defined by its past. This country can make a different set of choices about what it wants to be. And those choices can be as expansive and as joyful and as justice-oriented as we can imagine them to be. And ultimately, what I want for any kid is to feel like they can be a kid, and to just have so many of the joys and make the mistakes and experience the sort of unique texture of adolescence in ways that we would want for any of our kids, in ways that don't feel like they have, potential lethal implications for who they are, or for their lives. So, yeah, if you ask my 4-year-old what he wants to be, he's like, I want to be a chef, an astronaut, a superhero, a comic book, not like a comic book creator. He wants to be a comic book. Like, I want to be a comic book, and I want to be ketchup. And like, I want him to believe that he can be all those things. I don't know if he understands the mechanics of becoming ketchup, but like that's, there's not, as you all, with children know, there's nothing like, the excitement and the joy and the silliness that your kids have about the world and their lives and their future, and that's, that's what I want for any kid.
Thank you so much. One of our viewers and a Courageous Community fellow, Stephanie Gates, says, this was an enlightening discussion. I'm thankful to have been able to listen in. The next question we have from an online viewer asks, how do you compare the necessary teaching on this subject in the U.S. versus other countries? Is there one specific region or country that we can look to as an example of honest conversations as a society?
Every country has its own unique history, its own unique challenges, its own unique history of crime against humanity and violence and oppression. I recently spent time in Berlin last fall, for a piece that I've been working on for The Atlantic about how Germany memorializes its past and its relationship to the Holocaust. And I think it's very easy to look at Germany and be like, wow, Germany does it right. Germany, like, look at all these monuments they have to the Holocaust. Look at all these commemorations they do to the Holocaust. Look at how it shapes like every part of their social and political life. Feeling tethered to this shame and this past of what was done in their name. What's interesting though is that like the social context of Germany is very different than the United States. For example, in Germany today, only 0.25% of the population is Jewish. That's very different than the United States, where there are 45 million black people, right? Like, I mean, the Holocaust was a slaughter of proportions that I didn't even fully, even as someone who has read extensively about it, that I didn't fully understand until I was there. I mean, they killed 2/3 of the Jewish people on that continent. And as a result, there are hardly any Jewish people in Germany. I think this is my wife calling because she's like, "Are you
I
finished
know.
yet?"
Are you on your way?
So the way that this conversation happens in Germany is different than the way that it happens in the United States, in part because in Germany, Jews are almost as many Jewish people I spoke to there, like they would say we're a historical abstraction. Like, because people are more confronting the idea of Jewishness more than they are confronting actual Jewish people. And that has a very different set of implications in the United States, because there are a lot of us, there's still 12, 13% of the population. And so you can't sort of put a wreath down to say sorry about slavery without then creating or being asked to create policies that actually impact the material, shift the material circumstances of these communities. And so, that's a way of saying I don't know that there's any specific country that does it incredibly well, as much as it's a whole bunch of countries with different histories and different ways that history manifests itself. I just have to text my wife to tell her that I'm
Yes,
that I'm
and
alive.
we should move toward our end, just as I see my sister Tamar standing there.
Sorry, just one last question from Barrington. We're trying to eke it out because we missed a chunk, so thank you for your patience.
Hi, and thank you so much to both of you. It's nice to see you. It's easier to see you this way. So I have not read it, but I've heard many references to the letter from Martin Luther King and from the Birmingham jail. And it seems that the implication there is that white liberals are somewhat a danger because it's a lot of talk and not doing. So I guess my question would be whether you agree with that and what someone, like a lot of people in this room who consider ourselves white progressives and who do want to help the cause, what can we do that you think would be most helpful?
Yeah, I mean, the letter from a Birmingham jail is one of Dr. King's most important, one of the most important documents, not even just by Dr. King, but I think that's been written in the 20th, it was written in the 20th century on a global level. I mean, I think that part of what King is talking about is he's referencing this group of clergy who were telling him, like, you're going too fast, like, we support you, but like you're asking for too much, you're asking too fast, you shouldn't do it this way, you should do it that way. And he's saying, part of what he argues is that the largest impediment to social progress are the people who say they are with you, but then who try to dictate how you move toward freedom, and who try to tell you the best way, the most effective way to liberating yourself. And he sort of challenges them to just like, you keep telling us to wait, but like, how, that has a very different set of implications for you than it does for us. It's easy for you to tell us to wait because you don't live under the sort of omnipresent violence of this institution. You don't have your family members and people in your community lynched. You don't have people who are prevented from going to to like quality schools. You know, my grandfather, you know, who's still alive today, my grandfather didn't have a high school in his county. So if he wanted to go to high for black students, so he had to go to an entirely different county in Mississippi to go to high school. And he was very lucky that he was able to sort of cobble together a network of, like, he lived on the couch of his sister's cousin, like his cousin, and rarely saw his family back home, and all these. I say that because it's easy to tell somebody to wait and to be patient when the implications of that waiting don't materially, socially, and psychologically impact those folks in the same way. So, you know, what would I say to white liberals now? You know, I think it's tied into what we've been saying so much in this conversation. It's to move with curiosity, to move with humility, to always extend empathy, and to do, in part, I think, some of what you all are doing. Like, I'm cognizant of the fact that when I am in a room, conversations about race manifest themselves differently than they do when I'm not in that room, right? Like, if you are surrounded by only other white people, having a conversation about a host of racial or social, political issues, the conversation, the texture of the conversation is sometimes not in like super direct ways. It's not like people just automatically start dropping racial slurs or anything necessarily, but the texture of that conversation looks and feels different when you are in a room full of only white people than when you are in a room of mixed company, so to speak. So I'm always interested in, like, what are you saying or doing when other people aren't looking, when it can't be understood as a performance, when it can't be like, what are you doing for black people? What are you doing for historically marginalized communities when nobody's going to give you a pat on the back for it, when nobody's going to say thank you for doing it? Like, what, you know, I always think, and this is of course across a range of things, issues of patriarchy, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia. I'm always thinking, like, what would I want someone to do for me if they were in a room where something was being said, and what responsibility do I have, you know, if I'm in a room where somebody says something homophobic, or if I'm in a room where somebody says something sexist, or if I'm in a room where somebody says something really bigoted about immigrants, or whatever the case may be. What would I want people to do on my behalf? Mm-hmm. What would I want them to say? How would I want them to move in that space if I knew about it? Like, and I think just making decisions based not on trying to prove to people that you have, like, crossed the threshold of critical consciousness, or that you get it, but because it's right. And because it is aligned, again, we keep coming back to it. I feel like there's so many recurring themes in this conversation. But, like, that you are getting closer to the version of yourself that you say you want to be. I think that's what I want for all of us. You know, not just white people or white liberals or white moderates or whatever the case may be, but, you know, what are we doing when people aren't looking? You know. What are we saying? How are we voting? What are we advocating for when we won't get any credit for it? You know, because that's the hard thing, is to do it when, like, nobody knows, and when nobody's going to care, and when nobody's going to tell you you're a good person. What do you do in those moments?
Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. All right, over to you, Zena.
Clint, first of all, thank you, friends in Barrington. I missed you all. See you next month. In the epilogue, you have this amazing conversation with your grandmother after having been to the museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And she's talking about the difficulty of walking through the exhibits. And then out of nowhere, she says to you, I lived this. And she says it several times. I'm going to ask my friends online and in Barrington a question in a moment, because I have the prerogative of ending every time we gather. But what happened when your grandmother said, "I lived this"?
I mean, I think it was a powerful moment in part because it revealed to me how proximate to this history she was. And I think it also revealed it to her. I mean, and that's the benefit of these sort of intergenerational conversations. It's not only that they teach something to the interviewer necessarily, but I think, you know, in that conversation, my grandmother and my grandfather, in their respective conversations, unearthed a lot of things that had kind of remained swept under the proverbial rug for a long time, and pushed them to think about how their past has shaped their lives, and it pushed them to sort of excavate memories that they had kept pushed down for a long time. And I think it was generative in that way for both of us. And you know, I just think when this book was, you know, went #1 on the bestseller list, and the first people I called were my grandparents. I like FaceTimed them, and when President Obama put it on his list, it was a real, especially for my grandfather, I think it was a real moment where, you know, he never imagined that he would see a black person as president of this country. And to have that compounded by the fact that that president then read a book by his grandson in which he was featured, you know. So he's sitting there, you know, this 91-year-old man thinking about this person that he never imagined who would have ever existed.
Who knows his
reading
name?
about his story, who knows his name.
Yeah.
You know, if no one had ever bought the book, it would have been worth it for a moment like that.
Friends, Clint's grandmother said, "I lived this." There is going to come a time when you have to say, when I have to say, "I lived this." And the this that we are living is this fulcrum moment in our nation, when the door is open for this kind of conversation. So when the generations who follow us stand up and ask, "What did you do in this moment?" If you start the sentence with, "I lived this," how will you end it? What will you and I have done to further the truth-telling that is offered us in this book? Because you and I are living this, and someone is going to ask us what we did with what we learned. Blessings, Barrington. Would you join me in thanking our brother and our friend for being with us tonight? That would mean applause, guys.
Thank you all so
Blessings.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, Barrington.
Thank you
Good
so
night,
much.
Beyond Barrington.
Lots of applause over here. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you
very
all.
much.